May 8, 1942. Coral Sea, South Pacific. 1,142 hours. The USS Yorktown heaved violently as the 551-pound armor-piercing bomb punched through her flight deck 15 feet inboard of the island superstructure. Lieutenant Milton Ricketts, standing at his damage control station on the third deck, felt the entire carrier shudder. The bomb didn't explode on impact. It kept going, penetrating the flight deck, the gallery deck, the hangar deck, the second deck, the third deck, 50 feet of American steel, and wood before finally detonating in a compartment directly above the forward engine room. The explosion ripped through 6 compartments instantly. Fire erupted across 3 decks and 24 frames. The lighting systems went dark. The number 2 elevator mechanisms twisted into useless metal. The radar system died. The refrigeration units failed. And from frames 100 to 130, near-miss bombs opened hull seams like tin cans, rupturing fuel oil compartments. A 10-mile-long oil slick began trailing behind the wounded carrier as she limped away from the battle that had just claimed USS Lexington. Lieutenant Ricketts, mortally wounded but refusing to fall, deployed fire hoses and contained what could have been a catastrophic blaze before he collapsed. He would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. But as the Yorktown's damage control teams surveyed the devastation, one assessment became clear. This carrier was finished. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch stood on the damaged bridge and made the calculation that every naval officer dreaded. The bomb had penetrated 5 decks. 6 compartments were destroyed. Hull seams were burst across 30 frames. The carrier was trailing oil visible from miles away. He turned to his staff and delivered his professional judgment: 90 days. Minimum 90 days at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Bremerton, Washington. His assessment wasn't pessimism, it was mathematics. The Yorktown would need to limp 18 days back to Pearl Harbor at reduced speed. Then she'd require transport to a major West Coast facility. The structural damage alone represented thousands of man-hours. The electrical systems would need complete rewiring. The elevator mechanisms required precision machinery work. The hull seams demanded welding in dry dock. 3 months was actually an optimistic estimate for damage of this magnitude. What Fitch didn't know, what no American officer knew on May 8, 1942, was that Japanese naval intelligence was watching, monitoring, calculating, and smiling. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the Yorktown burning and listing. Their pilots reported her heavily damaged, possibly sunk. Japanese intelligence officers, studying the photographs and pilot reports, made their own assessments. If the Yorktown survived at all, she would require, by Japanese standards, at least 4 to 6 months of repairs at a major naval facility. This wasn't arrogance. This was cold calculation based on Japanese naval repair capabilities. When the carrier Shokaku, also damaged at Coral Sea, returned to Japan, she would spend months in dry dock at Kure Naval Arsenal. The Japanese understood carrier repair because they performed it constantly. A bomb penetrating 5 decks represented catastrophic structural damage. Hull seam ruptures required complete dry dock work. Electrical system failures meant extensive rewiring. This was months of work. Perhaps 6 months. Perhaps longer. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the principal planners of the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the intelligence reports on American carrier strength for the upcoming Midway operation. USS Lexington, sunk at Coral Sea. USS Yorktown, heavily damaged, estimated repair time 4 to 6 months minimum. USS Saratoga, torpedoed in January, still in repairs on the West Coast. That left only 2 operational American carriers in the Pacific, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet. The mathematics were simple. Admiral Yamamoto's Kido Butai would bring 4 fleet carriers to Midway: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Americans could field, at most, 2 carriers. The Japanese would have numerical superiority, tactical superiority, and the element of surprise, or so they believed. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff refined their operational plans. 4 Japanese carriers versus 2 American carriers. The odds were excellent. The element of surprise was confirmed through their own intelligence failures. They remained convinced their naval codes were secure. And the Yorktown, that troublesome carrier that had disrupted their Coral Sea victory, would be sitting in a dry dock somewhere on the American west coast, irrelevant to the coming battle. The Yorktown specifications made the Japanese assessment seem reasonable. 809 feet long, 25,500 tons displacement, capable of carrying 90 aircraft. A bomb penetrating 5 decks in such a vessel represented structural damage that touched the very spine of the ship. The Japanese knew their own carriers, knew how long repairs took, how complex the work was, how many specialists were required. What the Japanese intelligence officers couldn't imagine, what their own experience told them was impossible, was that the Americans operated under fundamentally different rules. That American shipyards didn't calculate repair time the way Japanese shipyards did. That American industrial capacity wasn't constrained by the same limitations that governed Japanese facilities. In their defense, the Japanese assessment was entirely logical based on their own capabilities. When damage this severe occurred to a Japanese carrier, repairs took months. Why would American repairs be any different? Steel was steel. Welding was welding. Electrical systems were electrical systems. The laws of physics and engineering applied equally to both nations. Or so they thought. On May 8, 1942, as the Yorktown began her long journey back to Pearl Harbor trailing that 10-mile oil slick, Japanese naval planners finalized their midway operation orders. The Americans would have 2 carriers at best. The Japanese would have 4. The outcome was, by any rational calculation, inevitable. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that in 10 days, their entire strategic calculation would be shattered by something they hadn't accounted for in their meticulous planning. The terrifying efficiency of American wartime industry when time no longer mattered, when regulations became optional, and when impossible became merely a suggestion. The Yorktown was finished, they were certain. 90 days minimum, by American estimation. 4 to 6 months minimum, by Japanese calculation. Either way, she was irrelevant to Midway. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong a calculation could be. May 27, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 0900 hours. 1 day ahead of schedule. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in waders in Drydock No. 1 while pumps were still draining water. The caissons had closed behind the Yorktown less than an hour ago. Steam still rose from the carrier's damaged hull as seawater poured off twisted metal. Nimitz wasn't waiting for the drydock to empty completely. He couldn't afford to wait. His chief of staff handed him the decoded intercept one more time. Commander Joseph Rockefeller's team at Station HYPO, working in the basement of Building 1, had broken the Japanese JN-25 naval code. The intelligence was crystal clear. 4 Japanese carriers would strike Midway Island on June 4th. That gave the Pacific Fleet exactly 8 days. 8 days. Nimitz looked up at the Yorktown's hull. Burst seams ran from frame 100 to frame 130, 30 feet of open steel. The fuel oil compartments were ruptured. Above the waterline, the damage was worse. 6 compartments destroyed. 3 decks of lighting systems dead. The No. 2 elevator mechanism twisted into scrap metal. Radar systems offline. Refrigeration failed. This was months of work, not days. Captain Claude Gillette, Pearl Harbor's yard superintendent, stood beside Nimitz. His preliminary assessment had been delivered to the Admiral's office at 0700 hours. Possible, but it will take a supreme effort. Nimitz turned to Lieutenant Commander H.J. Pfingstag, the hull repair expert. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that occurs when a superior officer asks for a miracle and a subordinate calculates whether his career can survive saying no. "We must have this ship back in 3 days," Nimitz said. Pfingstag gulped. His throat worked. 3 days for work that should take 3 months. Finally, "Yes, sir." What happened next would redefine what American industrial capacity meant in wartime. By 1,000 hours, while water still remained in the drydock, over 1,400 civilian workers from the Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard were swarming over the Yorktown. They didn't wait for official work orders. They didn't wait for technical drawings to be prepared. They didn't wait for the drydock to fully drain. They started immediately. The Yorktown's original construction drawings were pulled from archives and spread across makeshift planning tables. Foremen shouted instructions directly from these blueprints. There was no time for the standard Navy planning process, no time for formal work orders, no time for union jurisdiction disputes, no time for safety committees to review procedures. Every welder in Pearl Harbor was mobilized. The shipyard couldn't generate enough electricity for the welding equipment required, so the civilian power company instituted rolling blackouts across Oahu. Residential neighborhoods went dark in shifts throughout the night so that sparks could fly in Drydock Number 1. Hawaiian civilians sat in darkness, not knowing why, while their power was diverted to save a carrier they didn't know existed. The burst hull seams from frames 100 to 130 required welding from the inside and outside simultaneously. Teams worked in the carrier's oil-contaminated compartments, breathing through masks, welding in spaces that technically should have been purged for days before any work began. Nimitz had waived the safety regulation requiring fuel tanks to be fully purged, a regulation written in the blood of sailors killed by explosions in previous repair operations. The bomb damage to the interior was even more complex. 6 compartments had been destroyed on May 8. Complete reconstruction was impossible in 3 days. The solution was brutal pragmatism. Wooden timbers. Load-bearing wooden timbers were installed to support the flight deck structure where steel beams had been twisted by the explosion. The flight deck would literally be held up by wood instead of steel. The electrical systems presented another nightmare. The bomb explosion had destroyed lighting across 3 decks and 24 frames. Proper repair would require removing and replacing miles of wiring. Instead, electricians ran temporary cables on the outside of bulkheads, creating a chaotic spider web of power distribution that violated every Navy electrical safety standard. The radar system couldn't be fully repaired. The refrigeration system couldn't be fully restored. The number 2 elevator mechanism. The gears were damaged, but not destroyed. Mechanics worked through the night grinding, filing, and adjusting until the elevator could function, though not to specification. By the end of the first 24 hours, May 28 at 0900, observers began to notice something extraordinary. The hull seams were closed. The temporary structural timbers were in place. The electrical cables were being run. The Yorktown was taking shape not as a fully repaired carrier, but as something that could fight. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the Yorktown's commander, walked through his ship on the morning of May 29. What he saw defied naval engineering standards. Wooden timbers supporting the flight deck. Electrical cables running along exterior bulkheads like vines. Welding that showed stress marks because it had been completed too quickly. A radar system running at reduced capability. Refrigeration that would fail in tropical heat. By any standard definition, the Yorktown was not fully repaired. She was patched, jury-rigged, held together by welds that hadn't fully cooled and timbers that shouldn't bear the load they were carrying. But she could sail. She could launch aircraft. She could fight. On the morning of May 30, 1942, 72 hours after entering Drydock Number 1, the USS Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor. Shipyard workers were still aboard, finishing tasks as the carrier left the channel. Some were ferried off by tugboat once the carrier cleared the harbor. Others remained aboard for the transit to Midway, completing work while the Yorktown sailed toward battle. Squadron crews from the USS Saratoga, which was still undergoing repairs in San Diego, had been flown to Pearl Harbor to supplement the Yorktown's depleted air group. These pilots received no familiarization time with the carrier they'd be flying from. They were simply told, "You launch from Yorktown on June 4th. The Yorktown's damaged superheater boilers hadn't been touched in the frantic 3-day repair. This was the one repair that couldn't be completed in time. It would have required pulling the boilers entirely. The consequence, the Yorktown's top speed was reduced from 32 knots to approximately 30 knots. In a carrier battle where speed determined survival, this was a critical limitation. But none of this mattered to Japanese intelligence because Japanese intelligence didn't know the Yorktown existed as a combat-ready vessel anymore. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft hadn't observed Pearl Harbor during the repair period. Japanese submarine picket lines, which were supposed to monitor American fleet movements, hadn't been positioned yet. They were still en route when the Yorktown departed. The Japanese naval staff's last confirmed intelligence on the Yorktown was from May 8. Heavily damaged, probably sunk, minimum 4 to 6 months repair time if she survived. On June 2, 1942, northeast of Midway Island, Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher rendezvoused with Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. 3 American carriers gathered at Point Luck: USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown. The Japanese were still planning for 2 American carriers. The Americans had 3. And the third carrier, the one the Japanese thought was sitting in a dry dock in Bremerton, had been repaired in a time frame that Japanese naval engineers would have considered physically impossible. The signs were there, but the Japanese couldn't see them yet. Their intelligence system had been designed around their own industrial capabilities. They calculated repair times based on Japanese shipyard performance. They assessed American responses through the lens of Japanese logistical constraints. What they hadn't accounted for was a nation that could mobilize 1,400 skilled workers in hours, that could bypass safety regulations when necessary, that could divert civilian power to keep welding equipment running 24 hours a day, that could substitute wooden timbers for steel beams and call it mission capable. The expectation was 90 days minimum. The reality was 72 hours. The Japanese naval staff, preparing their Midway fleet, still believed they faced 2 carriers. They were about to encounter 3. And the presence of that third carrier, impossible by all rational calculation, would shatter their entire strategic plan. But the real lesson wasn't in the numbers. It wasn't in 3 carriers versus 2. The real lesson was in what those 72 hours represented: an industrial capacity that didn't calculate time the way the Japanese calculated time, that didn't follow rules the way the Japanese followed rules, that could accomplish in days what should have taken months. The Japanese were about to learn what American wartime industry meant when fully mobilized. And the classroom would be the skies over Midway Island. June 4, 1942. 240 miles northeast of Midway Island. 0600 hours. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier, stood on the Akagi's Bridge as the Kido Butai prepared to launch its first strike on Midway. The morning was perfect for carrier operations. Visibility unlimited, wind steady, seas calm. 4 Japanese fleet carriers steamed in formation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 108 aircraft were spotted on decks, preparing to devastate Midway's defenses. The Americans, according to intelligence, had 2 carriers somewhere in the area. Probably the Enterprise and Hornet. The Japanese had 4 carriers. The mathematics remained in Japan's favor. What Commander Fukuda didn't know, what no Japanese officer knew at 0600 hours on June 4th, was that a third American carrier was operating 60 miles to his northeast. And that carrier shouldn't have existed. The USS Yorktown launched her first search planes at 0600. 10 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers spread out in a search pattern extending 100 miles. At 0830, they returned having found nothing. The Japanese fleet wasn't where Nimitz had predicted. Then, at 0920, a message crackled across American radio frequencies. PBY Catalina seaplanes from Midway had spotted the Japanese carriers 200 miles southwest of Midway, bearing 320 degrees, heading southeast. Admiral Fletcher, commanding from the Yorktown, made his decision instantly. Launch immediately. All carriers. Full strike. The Yorktown went to flight quarters. Her jury-rigged electrical systems powered up. Her wooden timber-supported flight deck began cycling aircraft. Her patched hull cut through the Pacific at 30 knots, not her design speed, but fast enough. What happened over the next 6 hours would demonstrate not just the value of having 3 carriers instead of 2, but the cascading consequences of American industrial capability operating at speeds the Japanese couldn't anticipate. At 1,020 hours, American torpedo squadrons found the Japanese carriers. VT-8 from the Hornet went in first, 15 TBD Devastators attacking without fighter cover. Japanese Zero fighters shredded them. Only 1 pilot survived. VT-6 from the Enterprise attacked next. 14 aircraft launched, 10 were shot down. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was destroying American torpedo bombers with brutal efficiency. Then VT-3 from the Yorktown attacked. The carrier that shouldn't have been there launched 13 Devastators. 12 were shot down. Only 3 crew members survived. By 10:20, the sacrifice seemed meaningless. 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked. 35 had been shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. The Japanese carriers remained untouched, their combat air patrol at low altitude after massacring the torpedo squadrons. But the torpedo squadrons had done something the Japanese didn't immediately recognize. They had pulled the Zero fighters down to sea level. And at 1,022 hours, 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise arrived over the Japanese fleet at 14,000 feet. No fighters opposed them. The Zeros were still at wave-top height. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bombers, rolled into his attack on the Kaga. The bombs fell from 14,000 feet, accelerating to terminal velocity, punching through the Kaga's wooden flight deck and detonating among fully fueled aircraft being prepared for the second wave. Simultaneously, 17 SBD Dauntless from the Yorktown launched from the carrier that the Japanese thought was in Bremerton, Dove on the Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the attack. The Yorktown's dive bombers, operating from a carrier held together by wooden timbers and prayers, scored 3 direct hits in 3 minutes. Within 6 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were burning. Kaga, Akagi, Soryu. Fuel lines erupted. Ordnance cooked off. Aircraft exploded on deck. The carefully orchestrated Japanese attack plan disintegrated into 3 floating infernos. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was still operational. At 1,200 hours, she launched a counterstrike, 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Their target, the American carriers. At 12:05, the Yorktown's radar, the radar system that had been partially repaired in 72 hours, detected the incoming strike. The carrier that shouldn't be there went to general quarters. Her patched hull turned into the wind. Her wooden-supported flight deck launched every available fighter. 18 F-4F Wildcats climbed to intercept. The Japanese pilots saw a carrier they didn't expect. Their intelligence had said the Yorktown was heavily damaged, probably sunk. Yet here she was, launching fighters, maneuvering at speed. The pilots assumed they'd found either Enterprise or Hornet. They were wrong. They were attacking a ghost. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Her combat air patrol tore into the Japanese formation. But this was an elite strike force from the cream of Japanese naval aviation. They broke through. At 12:10, 3 bombs struck the Yorktown. One penetrated near the island, exactly where the May 8th bomb had hit. The second struck near the smokestack. The third hit near the aft elevator. Fire erupted. The boilers went offline. The carrier that had been held together by emergency repairs began dying. But the damage control parties, the same crews who had worked through the Coral Sea damage, responded with practiced efficiency. Fires were contained. The boilers were restarted. By 1550, the Yorktown was making 19 knots and preparing to resume flight operations. That's when Japanese pilots from the Hiryu's second strike arrived. They saw a carrier operating, launching fighters, making way. Their intelligence briefings said only 2 American carriers were operational. They'd hit one carrier at 12:10. Now, at 1600, they saw another fully operational carrier. They reported 2 American carriers confirmed. They were attacking the same carrier, the Yorktown. The carrier repaired in 72 hours was taking hits, recovering, and being misidentified as a different vessel because the Japanese couldn't conceive that a carrier damaged as severely as the Yorktown could be back in service. At 1620, 4 Japanese Type 91 torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's port side. The explosions ruptured the hull seams that had been welded shut on May 28 to 29. The patched compartments flooded. The jury-rigged electrical systems failed. The carrier listed 26 degrees to port. Captain Buckmaster, assessing damage that exceeded even the most optimistic repair capabilities, ordered abandon ship. But even in dying, the Yorktown had accomplished something extraordinary. Her presence at Midway, impossible by Japanese calculation, had absorbed both Japanese counterstrikes. Every bomb and torpedo aimed at Yorktown was a bomb and torpedo not aimed at Enterprise or Hornet. And while the Yorktown was taking her death blows, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Hiryu. At 1,700 hours, the 4th and final Japanese carrier erupted in flames. By 1800 hours on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway's outcome was decided. 4 Japanese fleet carriers burning or sunk. 1 American carrier crippled but still afloat. 2 American carriers undamaged and operational. But here's what the Japanese naval staff would realize over the following weeks. The presence of 3 American carriers instead of 2 hadn't just been a mathematical advantage. The Yorktown's presence had fundamentally altered the battle's dynamics. The Yorktown's dive bombers had destroyed the Soryu, 1/4 of the Japanese carrier strength eliminated by aircraft from a carrier that shouldn't have existed. The Yorktown's presence had drawn both Japanese counterstrikes away from Enterprise and Hornet, allowing them to survive undamaged. The Yorktown's radar had provided early warning. Her fighters had blunted the Japanese attacks. Her sacrifice had saved the other carriers. 3 carriers instead of 2. The difference between victory and defeat. The difference created by 72 hours of repair work that should have taken 90 days. Japanese post-battle analysis would struggle with this reality. Officers reviewing the battle couldn't reconcile the presence of a 3rd American carrier with their intelligence assessments. Some Japanese reports concluded that the Americans must have had 4 carriers present, that they'd faced Yorktown twice, not realizing they'd been attacking the same resilient vessel. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese naval planning. If American carriers damaged at Coral Sea could return to combat within weeks, then attrition warfare, the Japanese strategy of gradually wearing down American carrier strength, was impossible. American industrial capacity was operating at speeds that broke Japanese strategic calculations. But the real transformation wasn't visible in the battle statistics. It was visible in what happened after June 4. The Yorktown remained afloat after being abandoned. Salvage crews returned to the carrier on June 6. Destroyers formed a protective screen. The fleet tug Vireo began towing the wounded carrier toward Pearl Harbor at agonizingly slow speed. Even crippled, even abandoned, even with a 26-degree list, the Yorktown refused to sink. This carrier, held together by wooden timbers and emergency welds, was still afloat nearly 48 hours after taking 4 torpedoes and multiple bomb hits. It took a Japanese submarine, I-168, which had infiltrated the destroyer screen, to finish what the Hiryu's air groups couldn't complete. On June 6 at 15:30, 2 more torpedoes from I-168 struck the Yorktown. She finally rolled over and sank at 0701 on June 7, 1942. But even in sinking, the Yorktown had demonstrated something the Japanese couldn't ignore. American carriers, even when damaged beyond what Japanese engineering considered reparable, could be returned to combat in time frames that shattered every conventional calculation. And if carriers could be repaired that quickly, how quickly could battleships be repaired? Cruisers? Destroyers? The mathematical implications were devastating for Japanese war planning. Their entire attrition strategy depended on damaged American ships remaining out of service for months. But if 72-hour repairs were possible, then every ship the Japanese damaged might return within weeks instead of months. The transformation was complete. The contempt Japanese naval planners had shown for American repair capabilities, the confident assessment that a carrier damaged at Coral Sea would be irrelevant for months, had been shattered by 1,400 shipyard workers laboring around the clock in Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown had gone from heavily damaged wreck to combat-ready carrier in 72 hours. She'd participated in the decisive battle of the Pacific War. She'd destroyed one enemy carrier, absorbed strikes from two others, and saved her sister carriers by drawing fire. 90 days, the estimate had said. The Japanese calculated 4 to 6 months. The reality was 3 days. That 3-day miracle had just changed the war.